After New Year's, the cottage will finally be ours, my daughter-in-law whispered. And those 7 words changed everything I thought I knew about my family. At the time, she had no idea I was standing just a few feet away. Christmas Eve had always been my favorite day of the year. Even at 70 years old, I still woke up excited to bake, decorate, and gather with the people I loved most. That afternoon, I carefully placed 2 homemade pecan pies on the passenger seat of my old Buick and drove the 23 miles to my son Michael's house. Snow covered the lawns along the neighborhood streets, and colorful lights glowed from nearly every porch. It looked like one of those Christmas cards my late husband used to send to relatives every December. I arrived nearly an hour earlier than expected. Michael had told me dinner would begin at 5, but I wanted extra time to help set the table and spend a few quiet moments with my grandchildren before the house filled with noise. Carrying the pies, I walked up the front path and noticed the front door was slightly open. I smiled to myself. That was typical Michael. He had never remembered to fully close a door in his life. As I stepped onto the porch, I heard voices coming from the kitchen. First, I paid little attention. Then I heard Vanessa's voice. "We just have to be patient a little longer." Something in her tone made me stop. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I simply froze. Once she decides she can't manage that place anymore, everything becomes much easier, Vanessa continued. There was a brief silence before Michael answered. "Are you sure she'll agree?" My stomach tightened. Agree to what? I stood motionless beside the doorway, the cold December air brushing against my face. Then Vanessa laughed softly. "Of course she will. After New Year's, the cottage will finally be ours." The pie dish nearly slipped from my hands. For a moment, I wondered if I had misunderstood. Maybe they were discussing another property. Maybe there was some explanation that would make those words harmless. But deep down, I already knew exactly which cottage she meant. My cottage. The little white cottage beside Lake Alder. The place my husband and I bought 34 years earlier after saving every extra dollar we could find. The place where Michael learned to fish. The place where every family 4th of July and countless Christmas mornings had been celebrated. The place that held more memories than I could count. "Imagine what we could do with it," Vanessa said. "Property values out there have doubled." Michael didn't answer immediately. That silence hurt more than anything else. I had expected disagreement. I had expected hesitation. Instead, there was only silence. I quietly stepped back from the doorway and forced myself to breathe. My heart was racing, but years of life had taught me something important. The first reaction is rarely the best one. So I straightened my shoulders, adjusted my scarf, and put on the same calm smile I had worn through funerals, illnesses, and disappointments. Then I pushed open the door and walked inside. "Merry Christmas," I called cheerfully. The conversation stopped instantly. Vanessa appeared first, her smile bright and polished. Michael followed a second later. Neither of them looked nervous. Neither of them seemed worried that I had heard anything. They believed their secret was safe. They believed I was still the trusting old woman who never questioned anyone. I hugged my grandchildren, set the pies on the counter, and joined the holiday celebration exactly as they expected. I laughed at jokes. I complimented the decorations. I admired the Christmas tree. But beneath every smile, a question echoed through my mind. Why were they making plans for something that was never theirs? And by the end of that evening, I realized something even more troubling. This conversation hadn't been the beginning of a plan. It was the first piece of a plan that had already been in motion for a very long time. I barely tasted a single bite of Christmas dinner that night. Everyone around the table seemed perfectly comfortable. The grandchildren laughed as they opened small gifts. Christmas music played softly from a speaker near the fireplace. The scent of roasted turkey, cinnamon, and fresh pine filled the house. To anyone looking from the outside, we probably seemed like the picture of a happy American family. But once you hear something like that, you cannot simply forget it. Every smile feels different. Every conversation sounds different. Every glance begins to carry new meaning. I watched Vanessa carefully throughout the evening. She moved around the kitchen with effortless confidence, refilling drinks and complimenting decorations. Every few minutes she would place a hand on Michael's shoulder and smile at him. It was the same smile she had worn for years. Until that evening, I had always interpreted it as warmth. Now I wondered if I had been looking at it the wrong way. After dessert, my youngest granddaughter climbed onto my lap and asked if we would spend another summer at the cottage. The question caught me off guard. Before I could answer, Vanessa spoke from across the room. "We will see what happens. Things change." Her words were casual, almost playful. Yet something about them settled heavily in my chest. The cottage had always been a constant in our family. It was where birthdays were celebrated, fish were caught, and stories were shared around a stone fire pit overlooking Lake Alder. My late husband had spent years improving that property with his own hands. Every board on the dock, every flower bed, every rocking chair on the porch carried a memory. To me, it was never just real estate. It was the physical record of an entire life. Driving home later that night, snowflakes drifted across the windshield, while I replayed the conversation I had overheard. The roads were quiet. Most families were already gathered around fireplaces and Christmas trees. I felt strangely alone. Not because I lacked family, but because I suddenly questioned whether the family I trusted still existed. When I arrived at the cottage, the porch light illuminated the familiar white siding and green shutters. The place looked exactly as it always had. Safe, steady, unchanging. I stood in the driveway for several minutes before going inside. Once the door closed behind me, silence filled the rooms. The Christmas decorations I had carefully arranged earlier that month seemed different somehow. The stockings hanging above the mantel, the framed photographs lining the hallway, the old ornaments collected over 3 decades. Everything reminded me of my husband. I found myself standing in front of his favorite photograph. It had been taken during a fishing trip at the lake nearly 20 years earlier. He was smiling into the camera while holding a small bass. Looking at that picture always brought me comfort. This time it brought something else. Determination. My husband had never been naive about people. He believed kindness was important, but he also believed in paying attention when actions stopped matching words. Sitting at the kitchen table, I began thinking back over the previous year. Small moments surfaced one after another. Vanessa asking unusual questions about property taxes. Michael wanting copies of maintenance records. Conversations about retirement communities that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Individually, none of it had seemed alarming. Together, the pieces formed a picture I could no longer ignore. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider a painful possibility. What if the conversation I overheard was not the beginning of their plan? What if it was simply the first time I had accidentally seen the plan clearly? The days between Christmas and New Year felt strangely different. Nothing dramatic happened on the surface. No arguments. No confrontations. No shocking discoveries waiting in plain sight. Yet I could not shake the feeling that I had stepped into a story that had been unfolding long before I realized it existed. On the Monday after Christmas, Michael called me shortly after breakfast. His voice sounded cheerful. Too cheerful. He asked how I was feeling, whether I needed anything from town, and whether I had considered hiring someone to help maintain the cottage. The question seemed innocent enough. A year earlier I would have thought nothing of it. This time I paid attention. "Why do you ask?" I said casually. There was a brief pause. "No reason. I just know the property takes a lot of work." "The property? Not the cottage. Not your home. The property." I noticed the difference immediately. After we hung up, I made a pot of coffee and sat by the window, overlooking the frozen lake. Snow rested lightly on the dock my husband had built himself nearly 20 years earlier. I remembered helping him carry lumber from his pickup truck one summer afternoon. We had spent hours measuring boards while Michael, still a teenager then, jumped from the end of the dock into the water with his friends. Those memories felt alive in every corner of the place. It was impossible for me to imagine reducing them to a market value on a real estate listing. Later that week, I began sorting through old filing cabinets in my home office. I told myself I was organizing paperwork for the new year. In truth, I was searching for anything that might explain the sudden interest in my cottage. As I reviewed property tax records, insurance documents, and maintenance receipts, another memory surfaced. 6 months earlier, Vanessa had asked if I kept copies of everything in one location. At the time, she claimed she was helping her parents organize their estate planning. The question had seemed reasonable. Now it sounded different. I continued searching and noticed something unexpected. A folder containing several property-related documents was not where I remembered leaving it. I checked the shelves twice. Then a third time. The folder eventually appeared inside a different cabinet entirely. Perhaps I had misplaced it myself. At 70 years old, that was certainly possible. Yet something about it bothered me. I had always been careful with important paperwork. The uneasiness stayed with me throughout the afternoon. 2 days later, Michael and Vanessa stopped by unexpectedly with coffee and pastries from a bakery in town. Their visit was pleasant enough. Vanessa complimented my Christmas decorations. Michael fixed a loose hinge on the front porch gate. But I noticed something else. Several times, Vanessa's eyes drifted toward my office door. Once, while I was in the kitchen refilling coffee cups, I returned to find her standing near the filing cabinet. She smiled immediately. "I was admiring that old photograph on the wall," she said. Perhaps she was telling the truth. Perhaps not. What troubled me most was that I no longer knew which explanation to believe. That evening after they left, I sat alone beside the fireplace and stared at the glowing embers. The more I replayed the past year, the more certain I became of one thing. The conversation I overheard had not created my suspicions. It had simply given a voice to concerns that had been quietly building for months. And for the first time, I decided that instead of waiting for answers to appear, I was going to start looking for them myself. The next morning, I made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of calling Michael or confronting Vanessa, I drove into town and visited the county records office. It was a modest brick building I had passed hundreds of times without ever needing to enter. The young woman at the front desk greeted me politely and helped me locate information related to my property. I told her I simply wanted to make sure all my records were current. That explanation was not entirely untrue. While she searched the system, I studied the framed photographs hanging on the wall and tried to ignore the nervous feeling growing inside my chest. A few minutes later, she returned with several documents and a friendly smile. Everything appeared normal at first. The deed was exactly where it should be. The ownership records were correct. There were no unauthorized changes. I should have felt relieved. Instead, one detail caught my attention. Several months earlier, someone had submitted a formal request for public information connected to the property. The request itself was perfectly legal. Anyone could obtain basic records. Yet seeing the date made my stomach tighten. The request had been filed shortly after Vanessa began asking unusual questions about estate planning and property taxes. I thanked the clerk, gathered the documents, and returned to my car. Snow flurries drifted through the gray afternoon sky as I sat behind the steering wheel reviewing everything again. Nothing proved wrongdoing. Nothing established a conspiracy. But the timing felt impossible to ignore. On the drive home, I stopped at a small diner overlooking the highway. My husband and I used to eat there during long drives to the lake. The booths had not changed in decades. Neither had the smell of fresh coffee and homemade pie. I ordered lunch and found myself thinking about all the times I had dismissed small concerns because I trusted the people involved. Trust can be a beautiful thing. It can also make warning signs easier to overlook. Back at the cottage, I spent the rest of the afternoon sorting through old boxes stored in a hall closet. I was searching for financial records from previous years when I came across several family photo albums. For nearly an hour, I forgot about property records and legal documents. I simply sat on the living room floor turning pages. There was Michael at 10 years old holding a fishing rod nearly taller than he was. There was our first family Christmas at the cottage after we bought it. There was my husband smiling beside a freshly painted porch railing. Looking through those photographs reminded me of something important. Whatever was happening now had not erased the good years. It had not erased the love that once existed inside this family. Yet as evening approached, another memory surfaced. About 8 months earlier, Vanessa had offered to help organize my household paperwork while I recovered from a minor knee procedure. At the time, I had appreciated the gesture. She spent nearly an entire afternoon in my office sorting files and labeling folders. Until that moment, I had completely forgotten about it. Slowly, I stood and walked toward the filing cabinet again. The misplaced folder from the previous week suddenly seemed less like an accident and more like a clue. I opened the drawer and stared at the neatly organized rows of documents. Then I noticed something I had missed before. One of the folders contained copies instead of originals. The originals were nowhere to be found. And for the first time since Christmas Eve, I felt certain that someone had been preparing for something far longer than I ever imagined. For the next several days, I told no one what I had discovered. Not Michael. Not Vanessa. Not even the friends I usually spoke with every week. I needed time to think. More importantly, I needed facts. Assumptions could be wrong. Facts rarely were. On a cold Thursday afternoon, I drove into town to meet my longtime friend Grace Harper. We had known each other for nearly 30 years. Our husbands had fished together. We had celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, and retirements side by side. If there was anyone whose judgment I trusted, it was Grace. We met at a small coffee shop near the town square. After ordering tea, I noticed Grace studying my face with concern. "Something is bothering you," she said almost immediately. I laughed softly. "Am I that easy to read?" "Only when you are carrying something heavy." For a moment I considered changing the subject. Instead I shared everything. The conversation I overheard. The missing documents. The public records request. The growing feeling that pieces were moving around me without my knowledge. Grace listened quietly without interrupting. When I finished speaking, she stared down at her coffee cup for several seconds. That silence alone told me she knew something. My stomach tightened. "Grace." She looked up slowly. "There is something I probably should have mentioned earlier." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the January weather outside. "What is it?" She hesitated. "A few months ago, I attended a fundraising luncheon at the country club. Vanessa was there." I remained silent. She was talking with two women from a real estate group. I was not trying to listen, but I happened to hear part of the conversation. My hands tightened around my teacup. "What did she say?" Grace sighed. "She mentioned that a lake property would eventually become available." She sounded very confident. One of the women asked whether it belonged to family. Vanessa laughed and said something like, "Not for much longer." For a moment neither of us spoke. The sounds of the coffee shop seemed distant. Cups clinked. People chatted. A barista called out an order. Yet all I could hear was that single sentence repeating in my mind. Not for much longer. Grace reached across the table and touched my hand. I did not think much of it at the time. I assumed she was discussing some future investment. But after hearing everything you told me today, it feels different. I nodded slowly. The strange thing was that I did not feel shocked anymore. Instead, I felt clarity. For weeks, pieces of a puzzle had been scattered across my mind. Now they were beginning to connect. The questions about taxes. The missing originals. The comments about retirement communities. The conversation on Christmas Eve. The real estate discussion. None of it looked accidental anymore. Grace studied me carefully. "What are you going to do?" I looked out the window at the snow-covered street. A younger version of myself might have confronted everyone immediately. She might have demanded explanations and begged for honesty. But age teaches lessons that youth often misses. Sometimes the most powerful move is patience. "Nothing," I said calmly. Grace blinked in surprise. "Nothing." I nodded. "At least not yet." Because for the first time since Christmas Eve, I understood something important. I was no longer trying to figure out whether there was a plan. I was trying to discover how far that plan had already gone. The following week became one of the busiest periods I had experienced in years, although almost no one around me noticed. From the outside, my life appeared exactly the same. I still took morning walks along the lake when the weather allowed. I still attended church on Sunday. I still answered Michael's phone calls and listened politely when Vanessa talked about family plans for the coming spring. The difference was that I had stopped assuming every conversation was exactly what it appeared to be. On Tuesday morning, I scheduled a meeting with Thomas Reed, the attorney who had handled several legal matters for my husband and me over the years. His office occupied the second floor of a historic building near the courthouse. The familiar surroundings brought an unexpected sense of comfort. Thomas greeted me warmly and asked about my health before noticing the seriousness on my face. "What is going on, Eleanor?" he asked. For the next hour, I carefully explained everything I had learned. I described the conversation I overheard, the missing documents, the public records request, and the information Grace had shared. Thomas listened without interruption. When I finished, he folded his hands and leaned back in his chair. Do you believe someone has attempted to take ownership of your property? He asked. Not yet, I replied. But I believe someone expects to. Thomas nodded slowly. That distinction matters. He then reviewed my existing documents and ownership records. Everything remained legally secure. No unauthorized transfers had occurred. No suspicious filings existed. Hearing that should have reassured me completely. Instead, it confirmed something else. If a plan existed, it depended on my cooperation. Someone expected me to voluntarily make decisions that would eventually place the cottage within reach. Thomas spent the next hour helping me review options for strengthening future protections. We discussed estate planning, ownership structures, and ways to ensure my wishes remained clear regardless of future circumstances. By the time our meeting ended, several important updates were already underway. Nothing dramatic. Nothing hostile. Simply sensible precautions that any responsible property owner could take. As I left the office, a surprising feeling settled over me. Relief. For weeks, I had felt like a passenger watching events unfold around me. Now I felt something different. Prepared. Over the following days, I continued acting exactly as I always had. When Michael called, I answered cheerfully. When Vanessa invited me to dinner, I accepted. If either of them suspected anything had changed, they gave no sign. In fact, Vanessa seemed more confident than ever. During one visit, she casually mentioned a beautiful retirement community located about 30 miles away. The place sounded pleasant enough. Walking trails, social events, maintenance-free living. She described it in remarkable detail. Too much detail for someone making an innocent suggestion. I smiled and thanked her for the recommendation. Her eyes brightened immediately. For a brief moment, I sensed she believed progress was being made. That reaction told me more than any argument ever could. Later that evening, I returned home and stood on the back porch overlooking the frozen lake. The winter sky glowed pink and gold as the sun disappeared beyond the trees. My husband used to say that people reveal themselves when they think the outcome is already guaranteed. Standing there in the cold evening air, I realized something important. Vanessa believed she was moving closer to her goal. Michael seemed convinced the future was already taking shape. Neither of them understood that the future they imagined had quietly slipped beyond their reach days earlier. January slowly gave way to February, and with each passing week I became more certain that events were moving toward some kind of conclusion. The pressure remained subtle, but it was becoming impossible to miss. Michael began calling more frequently than usual. Sometimes he asked about my health. Other times he wanted to know whether I had considered making changes to the cottage. The questions always sounded casual, yet they followed a pattern. One evening he asked whether maintaining the property had become tiring. Another time he mentioned how much easier life could be in a smaller place closer to town. I listened politely and answered with the same calm tone every time. I am doing just fine. A few days later, Vanessa invited me to lunch at a restaurant overlooking the river. The invitation surprised me. We had always been cordial, but she rarely sought time alone with me. During the meal, she spoke warmly about family, grandchildren, and future plans. Eventually, the conversation drifted exactly where I expected it would. You know, she said, stirring her tea, there comes a point when people deserve to enjoy life without worrying about repairs and maintenance. I smiled. That sounds reasonable. Her expression brightened slightly. That is exactly what I think. You have worked hard your entire life. She continued describing retirement communities, smaller homes, and simplified lifestyles. I noticed she never once referred to the cottage as my home. She always called it the property. By then, the distinction no longer felt accidental. When lunch ended, she hugged me and thanked me for coming. As I watched her walk toward her car, I realized she believed she was gradually guiding me toward a decision. What she did not realize was that I was paying closer attention than ever before. 2 weeks later, Michael called with a suggestion. He wanted the family to gather for a special dinner at his house. According to him, everyone had been busy since the holidays, and he thought it would be nice to reconnect. His voice sounded relaxed, but something underneath it felt rehearsed. I accepted immediately. After all, I was curious. The dinner took place on a Saturday evening. The atmosphere was pleasant from the moment I arrived. The grandchildren played board games in the living room. Music drifted softly through the house. Vanessa greeted me with unusual enthusiasm. Throughout the evening, both she and Michael seemed especially attentive. They complimented my cooking. They asked about my hobbies. They laughed at stories they had heard before. It felt less like a family dinner and more like a carefully prepared presentation. Then, shortly after dessert, Michael cleared his throat and exchanged a quick glance with Vanessa. I recognized the look instantly. It was the look people share when they believe an important moment has arrived. Michael folded his hands on the table. "Mom," he began carefully, "there is something Vanessa and I wanted to discuss with you." The room suddenly felt very quiet. Even before he spoke another word, I knew exactly where the conversation was headed. The only difference was that now I was fully prepared to hear it. Michael glanced at Vanessa before continuing. The exchange lasted only a second, but it told me everything. They had discussed this moment many times. "We have been thinking about your future," Michael said carefully, "and we believe there may be a better arrangement for you." Vanessa nodded supportively. "Something that would make life easier and less stressful." I folded my hands in my lap and listened. The grandchildren had moved into another room, leaving the dining area unusually quiet. It felt as though everyone understood an important conversation was about to take place. Michael slid a folder across the table. "We put together some information for you." Inside were brochures, photographs, and printed pages describing a retirement community about 30 miles away. The grounds looked beautiful. There were walking paths, community activities, and maintenance services. Vanessa leaned forward. "We visited last month. It is wonderful. We thought you would love it." I studied the pages for several moments. Then I looked up. "You visited last month?" Vanessa smiled. "Just to gather information." Another interesting detail. They had been researching options before ever discussing them with me. Michael continued. "The truth is, Mom, we worry about you being alone at the cottage." His voice sounded sincere. That was what made everything so complicated. I believed he genuinely thought he was helping. Whether those ideas were entirely his own was another question. Vanessa pointed to a photograph. "Imagine having fewer responsibilities and more time to enjoy yourself." I nodded thoughtfully. "And what happens to the cottage?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Vanessa answered first. "Well, eventually it would probably make sense to sell it." There it was. The sentence they had been carefully circling around for weeks, perhaps months. Michael shifted slightly in his chair. "The market is strong right now." I noticed neither of them mentioned keeping the property in the family anymore. The language had changed. The objective was becoming easier to see. I closed the folder gently. "You have clearly put a great deal of thought into this." Relief flashed across Vanessa's face. She interpreted my calmness as agreement. "We only want what is best for you," she said. I smiled politely. "I appreciate that." Then I reached into my handbag and removed a sealed envelope. Thomas Reed had prepared it earlier that week. I placed it on the table. Michael frowned. "What is that?" "Something important I wanted to share tonight." Vanessa's confident expression faltered for the first time all evening. I opened the envelope and carefully removed several documents. Over the past few weeks, I completed an updated estate plan and established a protected ownership structure for the cottage. Silence settled across the table. Michael blinked. "You did what?" I continued speaking calmly. "The property is fully secured according to my wishes. Future decisions regarding it are clearly defined." Vanessa's face became very still. She was trying to understand what she had just heard. Michael looked confused rather than upset. "Why would you do that?" I met his eyes. "Because important things deserve protection." No one spoke for several seconds. The confidence that had filled the room earlier seemed to disappear. For weeks they had believed they were guiding events toward a predictable outcome. Now they were realizing that outcome no longer belonged to them. And as I watched their reactions, I understood something else. The conversation that followed was finally going to reveal who had been planning what all along. The silence after my announcement seemed to stretch across the entire room. Michael looked from me to the documents and then back again, as though he was trying to understand how a conversation that had begun with concern had suddenly become something entirely different. Vanessa remained perfectly still. It was the first time since Christmas that I had seen her without an immediate response. Finally, Michael spoke. Mom, are you saying you thought someone was trying to take the cottage? His voice carried confusion more than anger. I looked at him carefully. I am saying that over the past several months, I noticed things that did not make sense. Questions about my paperwork. Discussions about where I should live. Conversations about the future of my property that seemed to happen without me. Vanessa immediately shook her head. You are misunderstanding everything. I nodded calmly. Perhaps. But I also know what I heard. Her expression changed slightly. Not dramatically. Just enough. Michael noticed it too. He turned toward her. What does that mean? For the first time, Vanessa seemed uncertain. She tried to explain that she had only wanted what was best for me. She talked about convenience, safety, and planning ahead. Some of her concerns were probably genuine. Yet the more she spoke, the more Michael appeared troubled. Then I quietly mentioned the conversation I had overheard weeks earlier. The room fell silent again. Michael stared at Vanessa. You told me she did not know anything about that discussion. Vanessa opened her mouth, then closed it again. The look on Michael's face told me everything. Certain pieces of the story had not been shared equally between them. What followed was not an argument. It was something sadder. It was the slow realization that assumptions, expectations, and private conversations had created a future that existed only in their minds. I felt no satisfaction watching it happen, only disappointment. After a long pause, I gathered the documents and returned them to my envelope. The cottage is protected, I said gently. Not because I wanted to punish anyone. Because your father and I spent decades building something meaningful, and I intend to honor that. Michael lowered his eyes. For a moment, he looked like the young boy who used to sit beside his father on the dock during summer evenings. I never wanted to hurt you, Mom. I believed him. That was the hardest part. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. Then learn from this. No one spoke for several seconds. Eventually I stood, collected my coat, and prepared to leave. Vanessa remained quiet. Michael walked me to the front door. Outside, the cold evening air carried the scent of approaching spring. Snow still covered parts of the yard, but patches of green were beginning to appear. Before I stepped onto the porch, Michael stopped me. Are you angry? He asked quietly. I considered the question carefully. No, I replied. I am simply awake now. The drive home felt different from every drive I had taken since Christmas. The uncertainty was gone. The fear was gone. Even the anger had faded. When I arrived at the cottage, I stood on the porch and looked out across Lake Alder. The water reflected the moonlight exactly as it had for decades. Nothing had changed. Yet everything had changed. Because I finally understood that the cottage was never the most important thing I protected. It was the memory of the life my husband and I built together. It was my independence, my dignity, my right to decide my own future. And for the first time in a very long while, I felt completely at peace.